I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, interesting news from the UK Independent. A study of the University College of London has found, looking at some 400 study participants, that people who have extreme political views, either right or left, also have problems with what they call metacognition. In other words, they can't tell when they're wrong. And the questions asked during the survey, Bill, had nothing to do with politics. In fact, it basically showed them two pictures with dots on the pictures, and they had to determine which picture had more dots. And they found that the people with extreme political views, which were gauged on a spectrum that included their leaning toward authoritarianism or intolerance, both on left and the right, the people who had those extreme views not only stuck to their guns when they were wrong, but even resisted cash incentives and a little nudge with a second test that was designed to push them in the direction of the correct answer. And so because of all that, Bill, one might ask, aren't we wasting our time trying to argue with people on the hard left about what they believe and ways to try to save this country when all we're going to do is essentially make them double down on their wrong answers?
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely couldn't agree more. There's and I know most of our listeners know the details of this, many of them better than I do, but there is a medical practice that is looked upon as extremely ruthless, but it's absolutely necessary, and that practice is called triage. And in a medical emergency, let's say like a battle has just opened and casualties are streaming to the rear, and there's no longer the ability to treat everybody. What triage does is triage divides people, not surprisingly, into three different groups. The people who are lightly wounded go into one group. They'll survive without medical care, at least for a while. So those people are basically given some pain medication if it's available, and they're just going to have to sit there and suffer, but they're not in any immediate danger of dying. On the other hand, there are people that are casualties that are brought in that have had their entire insides blown out, and there is simply no amount of surgery that's going to save their life. And so those people are put into another category, and they're given a heavy shot of morphine because all of the surgery in the world is not going to save them. And of course, in the middle is the group that really needs the treatment first. That's the group of people whom surgery can save, but the surgery has to come now. It can be extremely cruel sounding, especially if you're one of those people that gets shunted off into the he's not going to make it category. But this is how you save the most lives with limited resources. And since we have limited resources, I'm completely, absolutely in favor of this kind of political triage. We're wasting our time on the far left, and we're also, to a large degree, wasting our time on the far right only because these people don't need to hear the message. Everything we should be doing should be aimed at the people who are movable in the middle. And I happen to think that's most people.
Bill, it seems to me, though, that while medical professionals may be skilled and experienced at triage, the average person who's engaged in the news of the day and political philosophy, so to speak, does a pretty poor job of that. In fact, I would hazard a guess that the people that we focus most of our attention on are the people who are least likely to change their minds. And then the second most group that we would focus our attention on are the people who just don't give a rip.
Well, let's deal with the first one first. Looking back on the work we do here and other work and so on, a great deal of it is directed at the far left, but it's not directed at the far left. Certainly the work, I'll just speak for myself.
Yeah, and I didn't mean just us, you and me.
No. I understand.
I'll
just speak for myself. The work that I do that's directed against the far left is not designed to convince the far left that it's wrong. The work that I do attacking the far left is to give people on the right ammunition to deal with people in the middle and to give people in the middle something to think about. So my fervent attacks on progressivism are not designed really, that's certainly not their primary purpose, to win over progressives. I've triaged most of those people out. What I'm trying to do is enthusiastically punch holes in their philosophy so that kind of, I just consider it to be philosophical contagion, doesn't spread to larger numbers of people. Now, this does raise a very, 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 very important issue. And the issue is persuadability and and moving the middle, because that's where the votes are, right? We know on any given election there are numbers of people that are going to vote against us no matter who we run. We know there are certain people that are going to vote for us no matter who we run. And then in the middle is a large block of people that have to be convinced.
And Bill, one might argue that your tactics at punching holes in the arguments of the hard left will not work with those people in the middle. They're too aggressive.
Well, if you're in the middle, I wouldn't say aggressiveness is your primary virtue.
I mean, you're too aggressive, not they're too aggressive.
Well, now this is this is a serious and compelling argument. It's a very compelling argument. I certainly know that when I go out to do a Tea Party or a Republican event, I am considerably more
bellicose.
I bring out the scalpel a lot more often than I do if I'm talking to like a real liberal group of younger people. With younger people, I tend to be a little more loose, a little more laid back, and a lot more patient. My personal take on this is a legitimately excellent point. My personal take on it, which is extremely self-serving, and that's why I like it so much, is I personally think that the degree of passion that I bring against these ideas is in its own way an indicator of how bad they are. I think bloodless arguments are absolutely useless. And since we can't do what we should have been doing this whole time, I mean, the conservatives are just not capable of it. They're not capable of it in terms of the output, and they're not capable of it in terms of the financial support that it needs. Ideally, we should be talking to people through stories and using messages that they don't even realize they're getting. This is the exact entire idea of why the left has infiltrated show business. Because when you go to see a movie, you are willingly hypnotizing yourself. And when you're in a movie, let's not have any doubt about this. If you're sitting in a movie theater watching a movie, you are in a hypnotic state. There's no question about it. All of your mental defenses are down. You believe in vampires, you believe in spaceships, you believe in ray guns, you believe in a lot of things, witches, all of this stuff. You buy all of it because you are in a very suggestive state where you basically say, for the sake of the entertainment, I'm going to drop my critical facilities and I'm going to pretend, that there are such things as vampires and werewolves and all the rest of it, because it's a thrill. But since you lower those defenses, everything else comes in for the ride. And this is the kind of thing that we've been doing. It's the kind of work I've been trying to do and try to get funded here with this other project that I've talked about occasionally. But the problem is, Scott, it's almost impossible to find conservatives who have the vision that progressives do on this. And I wish I didn't have to say this, but it's absolutely true. They have, the left has a far, far, far better understanding of what is important and how to play the long game than conservatives do. Far better understanding.
So let me just flip this around then. If you had been in that University College of London study that I saw reported on in the UK Independent, or I had been in that, of course, we would have known which card had more dots on it, and we would have been sure, even if they tried to bribe us to change our answer or to give us additional information to change our answer. So I guess the question is, Bill, how do we know that we're not kidding ourselves, that we're not wrong about some things not because we're, hyper-political monsters, but because we may have problems in our metacognition, our ability to recognize when we're wrong?
Beautiful question, which is why I have during my entire career, and I know you have too, Scott, this is why you ask such compelling and challenging devil's advocate questions and rebuttal questions. You do something that I'm not seeing on the other side. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying I don't see it. You are asking a challenging question, you get a response, and then you make a vigorous counterattack to that argument, not because you believe in the counterattack, but because if the argument is worth making, it should be able to not only stand on its own 2 feet, it should be able to stand on its own 2 feet after getting knocked around a little bit. And so you, in the practice of what you're doing on the show and what you've done all the years through Trifecta and Right Angle, have enough confidence in your belief system to be able to not only consider the other point of view, but to defend it, to be a champion of it. And I like to feel the same way. I like, my favorite part of everything I do is question and answer period, because it's unprepared, it's completely extemporaneous, and I have to fall back on the philosophy, and the philosophy is the philosophy of truth. I strongly think, and I'm a political extremist, no question about that, but I would be genuinely surprised if it was shown that I had a lot of difficulties with metacognition, and it's not because I'm made out of solid gold. It's because it is in the nature of what I do. Let me rephrase that. It is the goal I am looking for is not conservative philosophy. I am not out there gathering data and evidence in order to promote conservative philosophy. I promote conservative philosophy because that's where the evidence and the data seems to be. And that is a fundamental difference in how you look at the world. I don't go out there with, needless to say, I have a bias and I have a preconception, but that bias and preconception is based on continually testing this belief system against the facts. And one of the primary facts in the world is that people aren't perfect and people do people things. And I believe they always have, and I believe they always will. And so as a person who's moved quite a bit over the years, I compare myself now with myself when I was a lot more liberal. I was never a progressive, but in my college days, I was surrounded by actors. I was a theater major. I was a lot more liberal than I am now. And on a near daily basis, I compare my two selves. And I also further often think, what would a future Bill have to say to me to tell me that I was wrong? Now, in other words, if I was going to become a progressive, what would it take? And I realized it would take a compelling argument. And that kind of self-criticism is certainly not, I'm not trying to say that it's unique on the right. I think it's rare everywhere. But that ability to ask yourself if you're wrong is an enormous strength. It's an enormous strength. And it comes more and more frequently from a confidence that is born out of having asked that question a number of times and not being able to find too many cases. There was, as I've said before, I know it's flipped, but it's true. The reason I'm never wrong, Scotty, is because it's important for me to be right. And if somebody can show me I'm wrong, I'll move.
Well, to flip this question one final time, I suppose, Bill, the argument could be made that no movement in history has been able to advance effectively without a certain nucleus of people who had metacognition problems. As Steve Jobs might have said, here's to the crazy ones. Isn't it almost essential that somebody have the ability to lock in on an idea, shut out other alternatives in order to advance that idea and do something worthwhile?
See, this is why I love this philosophy so much, because as I was listening to your question, I thought, you're looking at throughout history, you're absolutely right with one exception. And that one exception, in my mind, was the American Revolution and the men that wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and gave us the philosophical grounding that you and I revere so much. Not just love, but revere. It seems to me that the men that formed the philosophical core of this country, rather than being a bunch of, just compare the two. If you look at the Russian Revolution, for example, you've got Lenin, who's a failed lawyer who spends his entire time in Switzerland, and all he's doing is reading Marx, and he's talking about Marxist theory with other Marxists, and then comes Trotsky, and now there's Trotskyism and Leninism, and all of this stuff is up here, and all of them are 100% sure that this is the new man, and this is the way it's going to go, and then they meet this guy from Georgia, Joseph Shashkili, and the next thing you know, Stalin's murdered everybody, and there you go. So if you look at the revolutionaries that made up the Russian Revolution, and Zinoviev and Bukharin and all the rest of them, you find people who are absolutely certain of the correctness of their cause, and the whole thing is a philosophical argument. It's like a giant term paper that killed 100 million people. But when you look at the American Revolution, what you find is you find so many divergent opinions on so many different things. And the only thing that these people had in common, really, universally in common, was as a product of the age of reason, they believed that the truth could be winnowed out by vigorous debate. And essentially, Scott, what they did was they applied the scientific method to politics. They basically said, if you are telling me that people will do this, then prove it. Show me where it's happened. Show me where it's happened in the past. Show me where it's happening now. And if not, then no. So,
and just to double down on that, Bill, perhaps
Sure.
one of the most startling things about the process of ratification of the Constitution was what a narrow margin it passed by in the key states where it had to pass in order to make it happen. And the stunning thing, though, was that the most passionate opponents of the ratification of the Constitution, including people like Alexander Hamilton. I mean, Hamilton gave people a real hard time in the convention where they were discussing it, and then turned around and became one of the authors of the Federalist to endorse it. So the startling thing was that the people who lost the argument agreed to live under the Constitution.
Agreed to live under the Constitution, Scott, I suspect because they had heard the arguments in favor. And for a group of men with that degree of none of them were unbiased. I'm not trying to say this. I'm not trying to say that they were angels and that every one of them was absolutely impartial. Not at all. On the contrary, the genius of the American founding is a recognition, clear recognition among virtually in fact, among everybody there, that people are in fact biased, that they do come with their own preconceptions, that these preconceptions have to be tested against one another to find out what's true, which is why our form of government is so resilient and so amazingly elastic in terms of, not in terms of its belief system, but in terms of the way it can handle things like, satellite communication. You look at the Soviet system, and the rigidity of the system was mirrored by the society that came downstream of it. There was the word of Lenin, and Lenin was right on everything. And if you didn't believe in Lenin, then you were a Zinoviite, Trotskyite, wrecker, and saboteur, and you had to be taken out and shot. And this is the difference between a philosophy that's willing to look at itself and has the confidence and the courage in itself to be able to say, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Missouri's the show me state, right? Okay, fair enough. That almost ought to be our national motto. Hey, I want to be right. I want to be right more than I want to be consistent, and I want to be right more than I want to be a conservative. If somebody can convince me that something is not true, I will move to that position. And the thing that's so startling to me about this age is just the paucity of the arguments that we're running. I mean, I constantly think that certainly there's somebody out there that's going to make the cogent case for progressivism, but having not seen it at all, it makes me think it's not there. It makes me think that the whole philosophy is, in fact, an emotional appeal to your vanity and your need for superiority. And that's the reason I believe this philosophy, not the other one, is because this philosophy seems to withstand not only external criticism, and is willing to commit internal criticism. And to me, that is the sign of a philosophically much more grounded and robust philosophy.
Well, the people who are willing to keep that learning switch on, to keep the pipeline open, to consider the possibility in humility that you may be wrong, or the kind of
yes,
the kind of viewers we covet here, the kind of people that we find profusion of among the members at BillWhittle.com who make this show possible. Those people are literally people who part with their own hard-earned money in order to make sure these kind of conversations can proliferate. They value the challenge. They value the fundamental principles that founded this country, and we are ever grateful to them. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.